The temperature that morning was 29 degrees. I know that because I checked my phone the second I heard the alert from my front door camera. It was 6:14 a.m. on a Tuesday in February, and I was still in bed, half asleep, reaching for my phone on the nightstand the way I always do when that little chime goes off. Usually it's just a delivery driver or a neighbor's dog wandering up the driveway. I almost put the phone back down without looking. I didn't. On the screen, I could see my grandfather standing on my front porch. He was 81 years old, wearing the brown cardigan he always wore to church, holding a single duffel bag, and he was standing completely still. Just standing there. Not ringing the bell, not knocking. Just standing like he wasn't sure he was allowed to. I was out of bed before I even realized I was moving. When I opened the door, the cold hit me in the face and I saw him up close. His lips were pale, his hands were shaking, and there was frost on the shoulders of that cardigan. He looked up at me, and the first thing he said was, "I'm sorry to come so early, sweetheart. I didn't know where else to go." I pulled him inside. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. My grandfather's name is Walter. He turned 81 last October, and up until that morning, he had been living with my aunt and uncle, my mother's older sister and her husband, in their house about 40 minutes from mine. That had been the arrangement for almost 3 years. Ever since my grandmother passed, and everyone decided, in that way families decide things without really asking the person most affected, that Grandpa Walter couldn't live alone anymore. He hadn't fought it. That was always his way. He just nodded and went along. I got him onto the couch, wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, and put the kettle on. He hadn't eaten. I found out later that he hadn't eaten since the night before, because my aunt had told him the night before last that things needed to change, and by 5:30 that morning, my uncle had loaded one duffel bag with some of Grandpa's clothes, driven him to my address, which my grandfather had given him because he had nowhere else, and let him out at the curb. Not the porch. The curb. Grandpa had walked up the driveway himself, in 29-degree weather, dragging that bag, and then stood on my porch for almost 20 minutes before the camera alert woke me up. He said he didn't want to ring the bell too early. He didn't want to be a bother. I sat down across from him with 2 mugs of tea and I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, what happened. He told me everything. My aunt. I'll call her my aunt throughout this, because I'm still trying to process the fact that she shares blood with my mother, who was the kindest person I've ever known, had been Grandpa Walter's primary caretaker on paper for the last 3 years. On paper. In reality, she hired a part-time homemaid who came 4 days a week, and my grandfather largely took care of himself. He cooked his own breakfast. He did his own laundry. He watched his programs, called his friends from church, tended to the tomato plants he kept on their back patio. He was not, by any definition, a burden. But he had money. That's the part that mattered to them. My grandmother had been meticulous about finances her entire life. She and my grandfather had saved quietly, steadily, for decades. When she died, she left behind a paid-off life insurance policy worth $60,000 and a savings account with just over $94,000 in it. There was also the monthly Social Security check. My grandfather received $1,840 a month, which he had always managed himself and used for his own personal expenses. Within 8 months of moving into my aunt and uncle's house, my grandfather had signed over power of attorney to my aunt. He told me, that morning over tea, that he hadn't fully understood what he was signing. He said she had told him it was just in case something happens, and that it was routine. He said the lawyer, her lawyer, had explained it very quickly, and he had trusted her. Within a year, the $94,000 savings account was down to $11,000. He showed me the bank statements. He had been keeping them in a manila envelope tucked into the inside pocket of his old briefcase, the one he'd had since before I was born. He said something felt wrong and he had started printing the statements at the library when my aunt took him for his weekly outing. He didn't fully understand all the withdrawals. He just knew there were many of them, and they weren't for his medical bills, Those were covered by Medicare. I sat at my kitchen table that morning and went through every single page. There were transfers to my aunt and uncle's joint account. There were cash withdrawals in amounts of $800, $1,200, $500, $700. There was a charge to a travel agency. There was a recurring monthly transfer of $1,500 labeled household expenses. For 3 years, the household expenses of an 81-year-old man who ate oatmeal for breakfast and tended tomatoes had apparently totaled over $54,000. I had to excuse myself and go stand in my bathroom for a few minutes. I ran cold water over my wrists. I looked at myself in the mirror. I said out loud to no one, "Okay. Okay." Then I went back to the kitchen and asked my grandfather if I could take a photo of every single page. He said yes. He said he thought maybe someone should know. I want to be honest about where I was in my own life at that point, because I think it matters. I was 31. I worked as a registered nurse at a regional hospital. 12-hour shifts, rotating schedule, not a lot of spare time or spare money. I lived alone in a 2-bedroom house I was renting on the east side of town. I had been single for about a year. I was not, in any sense of the word, prepared for what was about to become my life. But I thought about my mother. She had died 4 years earlier. Cancer? Fast? Brutal? The kind where you get a diagnosis in November and you're planning a funeral in March. And in those last weeks, she had made me promise 2 things. One was to take care of myself, which I have done a mediocre job of. The second was to look out for her dad. I hadn't done enough of that. I see that now. I had visited every few weeks, brought groceries sometimes, called on Sundays. I thought he was okay. I thought my aunt was handling it. I assumed, because it was easier to assume. I was done assuming. That afternoon, I called Adult Protective Services and filed a report. The woman on the phone was calm and professional and took down everything I gave her. The dates, the amounts, the bank statements, the timeline. She told me an investigator would be in contact within 72 hours, and that if my grandfather was currently in a safe location, which he was, that was the most important thing for now. She also told me, and I'm glad she told me this, that I should consult a family law attorney as soon as possible regarding guardianship and power of attorney. I called my grandfather's bank next. I explained the situation to the fraud department. They flagged the account, froze the remaining $11,000 pending an investigation, and sent me a form to fill out on my grandfather's behalf requesting a full transaction history audit. The representative I spoke to said this was more common than I wanted to know. Then I made one more call. I called my cousin, my aunt's daughter, who had always been closer to me than to her own mother, and who I knew had her own complicated feelings about how things had been handled. I didn't tell her everything. I just said that Grandpa Walter was with me, that he was safe, and that I needed her not to tell her mom for a few days. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I figured something was wrong. I'm glad he's with you." That told me a lot. My grandfather slept 12 hours that first night. I set him up in the spare bedroom with extra blankets and left the hallway light on, the way my mother used to do when he visited us when I was little. In the morning, I made eggs and toast, and we sat together at the kitchen table, and he told me stories about my grandmother that I had never heard before. About how they met, about their first apartment, how the radiator made a sound like someone banging pots together every night at 2 a.m., and they used to lie awake laughing about it. I wrote some of those stories down afterward. I wanted to keep them. The APS investigator came to my house 3 days later. She was a small woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a very thorough set of questions. She spent over an hour with my grandfather, alone in the living room, while I waited in the kitchen. When she came out, she didn't tell me what he had said, but she asked me for copies of all the bank documents and told me that the case had been elevated to a priority investigation. She also, before she left, very quietly said, You did the right thing calling us first. The family law attorney I found, I'll call her my attorney, was someone a colleague at the hospital had used for her own father's estate. I met with her the following week, and she spent the first 20 minutes just letting me lay out everything I had. Then she asked me a series of very specific questions. Did my grandfather have a will? Yes. Written 15 years ago. Was the power of attorney durable or springing? We weren't sure. Had he been declared mentally incapacitated at any point? No. Did he have any other assets, property, pension, anything not in that savings account? There was the Social Security, and there was a small pension from the plant where he had worked for 31 years, about $640 a month. She told me that given the documented financial irregularities, the existing POA was likely to be challenged and potentially revoked, and that pursuing a guardianship through the courts was the strongest way to protect him going forward. She also said that what had happened could constitute elder financial abuse under state law, and that if the APS investigation found sufficient evidence, there could be criminal referrals. I asked her to file for guardianship immediately. My aunt found out he was with me on day 5. I don't know exactly how. Maybe a neighbor? Maybe my uncle drove past my street. But she called me at 7 p.m. on a Friday, and she was not calm. She told me I had overstepped. She told me that Grandpa Walter had behavioral issues that I wasn't equipped to handle. She told me that she was his legal representative and that she expected him returned to her home by Sunday. She used the word returned like he was a library book. I let her talk. I had learned by then to let people talk. When she was done, I said, I've retained a family law attorney and filed for guardianship. You'll be hearing from her office early next week. Please direct any further communication about this matter to her. Then I hung up. My grandfather was in the next room watching Jeopardy. He looked up when I walked in and asked if everything was okay. I told him yes. He nodded and looked back at the TV. I sat down next to him and we watched the rest of the episode together, and I did not cry until I got to my room later that night. The calls from my aunt after that went to voicemail. My uncle showed up at my house once, on a Saturday afternoon, knocked on the door repeatedly for about 5 minutes, then left. I had already given my attorney his information, and she had sent a letter asking all communication to go through her office. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks after I filed. 6 weeks is a long time when you're living with uncertainty and a retired machinist who takes his blood pressure medication every morning at exactly 7 a.m. and likes his toast dark. But those 6 weeks were also, and I don't know exactly how to say this, quietly good. My grandfather taught me how to make his tomato sauce from scratch, the real way, the way his own mother made it. I got a small planter and put it on my back porch, so he could start his tomatoes even though it was February, and we both knew they wouldn't be ready until summer. He seemed lighter than I had seen him in years. He started calling his old friends again. He called his friend from church almost every Sunday morning, and I would hear him in the spare room laughing, actually laughing, and it hurt me to think about how long it had been since he'd had room to do that. In the meantime, there were documents. So many documents. My attorney requested full financial records going back to the date the power of attorney was signed. The bank's audit turned up $78,000 in transfers and withdrawals that could not be tied to any of my grandfather's documented medical or personal expenses. APS forwarded their investigation findings to the county DA's office. My aunt's attorney sent 2 letters, the first demanding my grandfather's return, the second shifting tone significantly and requesting mediation. My attorney declined mediation. She said we didn't need it. The hearing itself lasted most of a morning. My aunt and uncle were there with their attorney. My grandfather was there, calm and clear, and answered every question the judge asked him directly and without hesitation. He said he understood what guardianship meant. He said he wanted me to be his guardian. He said in a voice that didn't waver at all, that he had not understood what he signed 3 years ago and that he had felt afraid to say so. The judge revoked the existing power of attorney effective immediately. She appointed me as my grandfather's legal guardian. She issued a restraining order prohibiting my aunt and uncle from accessing any of my grandfather's accounts or assets. She also referred the financial documentation to the DA's office for review of potential criminal charges. My aunt cried in the hallway outside the courtroom. I walked past her with my grandfather's hand in mine and I did not look back. That was 8 months ago. My grandfather has a bedroom in my house that is actually his now. We bought him a proper bed frame. The kind he said he'd always wanted, solid wood, nothing that squeaks. He has a shelf for his books, and a spot by the window where his tomatoes grew all summer. Real ones, red and heavy, the best I've ever tasted. His Social Security goes directly into his own account now, which I help him manage with full transparency. His pension is restored to his control. The $11,000 that was frozen has been returned to him. The full amount that was taken, just over $78,000, is the subject of an ongoing civil case that my attorney is handling. I won't speculate on where that ends up. But it's not over. My aunt and uncle have not been criminally charged yet. The DA's office has said the investigation is ongoing. I have learned, working in healthcare, that justice moves slowly. I have also learned that it sometimes moves. My grandfather asked me once, a few weeks after the hearing, if I was angry. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I said yes, I was angry, but mostly I was sad. Sad that it happened. Sad that it took this long. Sad about the years when he was just quietly keeping bank statements in an envelope and hoping someone would eventually ask the right question. He nodded. He said, "Your mother would have asked." I said, "I know. I'm sorry I didn't ask sooner." He patted my hand. He said, "You asked now. I've thought a lot about what I would tell someone who is in the position I was in. Watching from a distance, visiting every few weeks, telling themselves that someone else has it handled. I would tell them, ask for the bank statements. Ask to see the medication list. Ask your elderly relative privately, with no one else in the room, if they feel safe, and if they feel free. Ask now. Don't wait for a 6 a.m. camera alert in 29-degree weather. Elder financial abuse is one of the most underreported crimes in this country. The National Council on Aging estimates that billions of dollars are taken from older Americans every year, and in the majority of cases, the person taking it is someone the victim trusted, a family member. Someone with a key to the house and a reason to be there. If you see signs, unexplained withdrawals, a sudden change in estate documents, an elderly relative who seems hesitant or fearful or unusually apologetic, Adult Protective Services exists in every state. Call them. The number is findable in 60 seconds. You don't need to have all the answers before you call. You just need to make the call. My grandfather is watching the game in the next room right now. In about 20 minutes, I'm going to go make us both a cup of tea. He still takes his dark with 1 sugar, same as always, same as long as I can remember. Some things, at least, don't change. I think about cause and effect a lot now. Not in any abstract way. Just the plain, observable kind. The kind where you trace a line from one decision to the next and watch how everything downstream changes shape because of it. My aunt made choices, small ones at first probably. A withdrawal here, a transfer there, telling herself it was fair, that she was doing the work, that she deserved something for it. And then the choices got bigger, because nothing stopped them. That's how it usually goes. Not a single dramatic moment of corruption, just a slow accumulation of smaller ones, each one a little easier than the last because the one before it went unchallenged. And my grandfather made a choice too, a quieter one. He kept those bank statements, month after month. He printed them at the library and tucked them into that old briefcase and said nothing to anyone, because he didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to be wrong about the people he was supposed to be able to trust. That choice, That quiet, careful, almost heartbreaking act of documentation is the reason we had anything to stand on when it finally mattered. I made choices too. For years, I made the choice to assume, to tell myself someone else had it covered. That's not a malicious choice. It's just a passive one. And I've learned that passive choices have consequences just as real as active ones. Inaction is still a decision. Looking away is still a direction you chose to face. What changed everything wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a perfect plan. It was just one morning when I stopped assuming and started asking. When I sat across from an 81-year-old man with a cup of tea and said, "Tell me what happened." And then I listened. And then I did something about it. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the legal process, not the courtroom, not the outcome, though I'm grateful for all of it. Just that. The decision to act rather than wait for someone else to act first. To trust that I was capable of figuring it out even when I had no idea what I was doing. To make the calls I didn't know how to make, and ask the questions I was afraid to ask, and show up for someone who had spent 3 years being quietly afraid to ask for help. I'm not telling this story because I think I did something extraordinary. I don't think I did. I think I did what any person with a functioning conscience eventually finds their way to doing when they stop being comfortable. The extraordinary part was Walter, sitting in that courtroom at 81, calm and clear, telling the truth without flinching, after years of being made to feel like a burden for simply existing. That kind of dignity doesn't come from circumstances. It's built over a lifetime of small, honest choices. And watching him in that room, watching him choose truth, even when it was hard and humiliating, and cost him the relationship with his own daughter, I understood something I hadn't fully understood before. Character isn't what you do when everything is easy. It's what you do when everything you trusted turns out to have been wrong. And you still choose to tell the truth anyway. I want to keep choosing that. I want to be someone who asks the question before it's too late. Who pays attention? Who doesn't let the discomfort of seeing something wrong talk her out of doing something about it? Walter's tomatoes came in red and heavy this past summer. Best ones I've ever had. Some things, when you give them the right conditions, grow exactly the way they were always supposed to.